You've never really left your old timeline. And yet, somehow, you're no longer there. That sentence can feel strange when you first hear it, almost like a quiet contradiction. But if you sit with it for a moment, if you let it land gently instead of trying to analyze it, you may recognize something deeply familiar. There are moments in life when you look around and realize that everything feels different, even though nothing dramatic seems to have happened. Same house, same city, same people, perhaps. And yet, the way you experience it all has shifted. Something inside you moved first. This is where the real meaning of quantum jumping begins, not with spectacle, not with science fiction fantasies of leaping into parallel worlds, but with a subtle remembering of who you are beneath the noise of effort and control. Many people imagine timeline shifting as a kind of jump, a sudden escape from one reality into another, as if one day you wake up and everything has magically changed. But that image can be misleading. It keeps the mind searching for an external event, a dramatic moment, a sign that proves something extraordinary has happened. And while the mind is busy searching, the truth is already unfolding quietly beneath it. So let's slow this down. Have you ever noticed that there are phases in your life when things begin to fall into place without force? Conversations flow more easily. Decisions feel simpler. Opportunities appear without you chasing them. You're not pushing the river, and yet it seems to carry you exactly where you need to go. Then, at other times, you can work twice as hard and feel as though you're swimming upstream, exhausted, frustrated, wondering why nothing responds. The difference isn't luck, it isn't effort, and it isn't timing in the way we usually think about it. The difference is vibration, the inner frequency you're living from. Quantum jumping, in its truest sense, isn't about going somewhere else. It's about changing the state you're broadcasting from within. When that state changes, reality doesn't argue. It reorganizes. Think of it like this. You don't move to a new house when you shift timelines. You're still standing in the same room, but the light changes. The color temperature shifts. Shadows soften. Objects that once felt heavy now feel neutral. Nothing physically moved. Yet the entire experience of the room is different. That's how timeline shifts actually occur. You didn't go anywhere. You tuned into a different version of here. This is where many teachings get misunderstood. People try to make the shift happen. They visualize harder. They repeat affirmations with tension in their jaw. They discipline their thoughts like a strict guard, afraid that one wrong idea will ruin the manifestation. And all of that effort, ironically, keeps them anchored to the very timeline they want to leave, because effort is rooted in the identity of someone who believes they are not there yet. The moment you need to struggle to become someone else, you've already defined yourself as the version who isn't. True shifting begins when that struggle softens, when you stop trying to outrun your current reality and instead allow your inner identity to change first. This is why some of the biggest changes in life happen during moments of surrender, after burnout, after loss, after you finally admit, I can't keep doing this the same way, not because suffering is required, but because those moments loosen the grip of the old self. The version of you who was clinging to control begins to relax. And in that relaxation, something new is allowed to emerge. Neville Goddard spoke often about this, though he used simpler words. He didn't talk about timelines or parallel worlds. He spoke about states. You don't change the world, he said. You change the state you occupy. And the world rearranges itself accordingly. A state isn't a thought. It's not even an emotion. A state is a sense of being, a quiet assumption about who you are. When that assumption shifts, reality has no choice but to follow. This is where science, interestingly, begins to echo ancient wisdom. In quantum physics, particles don't exist in a fixed state until they're observed. Possibility collapses into form only when attention interacts with it. In much the same way, your life doesn't lock into a single path until your identity, your inner observer, stabilizes in a certain frequency. You are not moving through time as much as time is moving through you. And when your inner identity changes, you don't feel like you've jumped anywhere. You simply notice that the things which once triggered you no longer do. The fears that used to dominate your decisions lose their authority. You respond differently. You choose differently. And those small, quiet differences ripple outward, shaping a new sequence of events. This is why real timeline shifts rarely announce themselves. There is no trumpet sound, no flashing sign that says, "You've arrived." Instead, there's a gentle sense of alignment, a feeling that life is meeting you halfway, like two dancers finally moving to the same rhythm. You may even look back one day and realize, I don't recognize the person who worried about that so deeply, not because you became careless, but because your inner ground changed. The river no longer had to fight itself to flow forward. And here's something important, something many people miss. You don't shift timelines by rejecting your current one. You shift by outgrowing it. Rejection is still attachment. Resistance keeps the old vibration alive. Growth, on the other hand, happens quietly, naturally, like a child who no longer fits into their old shoes. The child doesn't destroy the shoes in anger. They simply step out of them. When you release the identity that needed to struggle, to prove, to control, you don't feel like you've become someone new. You feel like you've returned to something familiar, something calm, something steady. That's why the word remembering fits better than jumping. You're not creating a new self. You're remembering the version of you that was never in conflict with life. This is also why forcing change never works for long. You can temporarily alter behavior, circumstances, even relationships. But if the inner identity stays the same, the old patterns eventually reassemble themselves. Reality is patient that way. It waits for coherence. And coherence doesn't come from effort. It comes from alignment. Alignment feels like relief, like exhaling after holding your breath for years. When you're aligned, you stop asking, "How do I get there?" and begin living as if you already are. Not in fantasy, not in denial, but in the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs proof to trust their own state of being. This is what people often describe as things just working out. It's not that the universe suddenly favors you. It's that you've stopped sending mixed signals. Your thoughts, emotions, and assumptions begin to point in the same direction, and life responds with the same clarity. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether you've already shifted timelines without realizing it, pay attention to how you respond to life now compared to before. Notice what no longer pulls you into old reactions. Notice what feels lighter. Notice where you're no longer forcing outcomes. Those are not accidents. They are markers of a new state stabilizing. And as that state stabilizes, reality will continue to reorganize itself quietly, efficiently, without drama to match the version of you that is now present. You didn't leave the old timeline behind. You simply stopped feeding it with your identity. And in that gentle remembering, a new version of life meets you exactly where you are without resistance, without effort, and without needing you to jump anywhere at all. 1. Timeline is not a path. It is a state. One of the quiet misunderstandings that shapes how we experience life is the idea that a timeline is something you move along, step by step, as if existence were a long road stretching from the past into the future. In that picture, you are always somewhere behind what you want, always trying to get closer to a better moment that has not yet arrived. This way of seeing time feels logical, even comforting, because it gives the mind a sense of direction and control. But when you look more deeply, when you begin to observe life from the level of awareness rather than habit, that picture slowly dissolves. A timeline is not a road you walk on, it is a state you inhabit. This distinction matters more than it may seem at first, because the moment you believe you are walking toward a future, you automatically place yourself in the position of someone who is not there yet. And from that identity, effort becomes heavy, patience turns into waiting, and life starts to feel like something that withholds itself until you earn it. Many people live their entire lives inside this subtle tension without ever questioning it. But awareness invites a different understanding. From the perspective of consciousness, timelines do not line up one after another like beads on a string. They coexist. Much like layers of sound in a piece of music, different frequencies are present at the same time. even though you may only be tuned into one of them. When you change the station on a radio, the music changes instantly, even though all the other stations were already there, broadcasting the whole time. You did not travel anywhere. You did not wait for the song to start. You simply shifted the receiver. Life works in much the same way. What we call a timeline is simply a consistent pattern of experience that arises from a particular inner state. That state is made up of your assumptions about yourself, your emotional baseline, and the identity you unconsciously return to again and again. When those elements remain stable, your life appears stable too, not because it is fixed, but because you keep selecting the same frequency. This is why two people can live in the same city, under the same economic conditions, even in the same family, and yet experience entirely different realities. One feels supported by life, even when challenges arise. The other feels constantly opposed, as if the world is something to defend against. They are not walking on different roads. They are inhabiting different states, and each state corresponds to what we might call a different timeline. Every timeline is sustained not by time itself, but by continuity of identity. As long as you keep seeing yourself in a certain way, reacting in familiar patterns, and interpreting life through the same emotional lens, the same type of reality continues to assemble around you. This is not punishment or reward. It is resonance. Think of it like this. A river does not choose its path each moment. It follows the shape of the land beneath it. When the land changes, the river changes. In the same way, life follows the shape of your inner terrain. When your beliefs soften, when your emotional tone shifts, when your sense of self evolves, reality naturally flows in a new direction without force. This is why real change often feels less dramatic than we expect. When you step into a new state, there is no loud announcement, no clear dividing line that says, "Before this moment, everything was different." Instead, you may notice that situations which once felt heavy no longer carry the same emotional charge. Conversations feel simpler. Decisions require less overthinking. You are still living your life, but the effort has drained out of it. That is not coincidence. That is a state change. And because timelines are states, not destinations, you do not reach them by striving. You enter them by alignment. Each timeline you experience is maintained by three quiet forces working together: your beliefs, your emotional patterns, and your inner identity. Beliefs shape what you consider possible. Emotions give energy to those possibilities. Identity decides which ones feel natural to you. When these three remain unchanged, the timeline remains unchanged as well. This is why positive thinking alone rarely creates lasting transformation. You can think new thoughts for a while, but if your emotional body still carries the weight of fear or unworthiness, and your identity still feels like someone who must struggle to survive, the old timeline will gently reassert itself, not because you failed, but because the deeper state did not move. Lasting shifts happen when identity shifts, when you no longer see yourself as the one who is trying to fix life, but as the one who is learning to trust it. When you stop relating to the future as something that must be controlled, and begin relating to the present as something that can be inhabited fully, that change alone alters the entire field you are living in. From the outside, it may look like nothing has changed. From the inside, everything has. This understanding also explains why time often feels different during periods of deep alignment. Days may pass quickly, yet feel full, or time may slow down, allowing you to be present in ways you never were before. This is not imagination. It is the natural result of living in a different state of consciousness, where attention is no longer fragmented by resistance. When you are no longer fighting where you are, time stops feeling like an enemy. And here is something subtle but important. Because timelines coexist, you are not required to destroy or escape your current life to experience a new one. The old state fades naturally when it is no longer fed by attention and emotion. You do not need to reject who you were. You simply outgrow that way of being. This is why many people feel a strange mix of gratitude and distance when they look back at their past. They do not feel anger toward it anymore. They simply recognize that they are not living there now. The emotional gravity is gone. The frequency has changed. That is the sign of a completed shift. In this light, the future is not something you travel toward. It is something you allow by becoming congruent with it internally. When the state that matches a different timeline stabilizes within you, life rearranges itself quietly to reflect that state. New people enter. Old patterns dissolve. Opportunities appear without effort. Not because the world suddenly became generous, but because you are no longer broadcasting conflict. This can feel unsettling to the mind, because the mind wants steps, plans, guarantees. But states do not respond to plans. They respond to permission. Permission to feel differently. Permission to release old assumptions. Permission to rest in a new sense of self without needing proof. When that permission is given, even gently, the timeline shifts on its own. You do not move through time to become someone new. You become someone new, and time reorganizes itself around that being. Once this is seen clearly, life becomes less about chasing outcomes and more about tending to your inner atmosphere. You begin to understand that your most important work is not fixing circumstances, but noticing the state from which you are meeting them. And in that noticing, without force or drama, a different timeline becomes your present moment. 2. Understanding quantum jumping correctly. One of the first things that needs to gently fall away when we talk about quantum jumping is the image most people carry in their minds. It is often dramatic, almost cinematic, a sudden leap, a portal opening, one reality collapsing while another appears. This image can be exciting, but it quietly pulls us away from the truth rather than closer to it. It keeps us looking for an event, a moment in time when something extraordinary happens. Instead of noticing the subtle shift that is already unfolding within us, there is no physical jump. There is no sudden escape from one world into another. And there is no miracle that arrives with noise and spectacle. Real quantum jumping happens far more quietly than that. And because of this, it is often missed or misunderstood. It does not announce itself. It does not ask for belief. It simply happens when a certain inner alignment is reached. And by the time you notice it, life has already begun responding. At its core, quantum jumping is an identity shift, not a change in behavior, not a change in circumstances, but a change in who you experience yourself to be. This is a crucial distinction, because many people try to change their lives by changing what they do, what they think, or what they hope for, while leaving the deeper sense of self untouched. They adjust strategies, repeat affirmations, set goals, visualize outcomes, and yet feel as though something invisible keeps pulling them back to the same patterns. That invisible force is identity. Identity is not the story you tell about yourself on the surface. It is the quiet, embodied answer to the question, who am I in this moment? It is the place you return to when nothing is happening, when no one is watching, when effort drops away. That place determines the timeline you live in far more than any action ever could. This is why quantum jumping cannot be forced. You cannot jump your way out of an identity. You can only outgrow it. When people hear that timelines shift through identity change, the mind often tries to turn this into another task. So who should I become? What identity do I need to adopt? But the deeper truth is softer than that. Identity does not change through pretending. It changes through realization. You don't become someone new by acting differently. You act differently because you have already become someone new. And this is where the misunderstanding clears. A quantum jump is not about becoming extraordinary. It is about becoming congruent. When your inner sense of self aligns with a different way of being, the outer world reorganizes itself to match that alignment. This is not mystical in the exaggerated sense. It is deeply practical. And many people have experienced it without ever using this language. Think of someone who has lived most of their life feeling unsafe, always bracing for the next problem. Even during good moments, part of them is waiting for something to go wrong. That expectation is not conscious, but it shapes how they interpret events, how they relate to others, and how they make decisions. Their identity is built around survival. Then, Perhaps after a period of exhaustion, loss, or deep reflection, something loosens. They realize they no longer want to live from that place. Not as a decision, but as a knowing. Slowly, their nervous system begins to relax. They stop scanning life for danger. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop proving their worth. Nothing dramatic happened on the outside, but inside, the sense of who I am has shifted. From that moment on, their life begins to respond differently. They meet different kinds of people. They are drawn to different opportunities. They say yes and no from a different place. Did they jump into a new world? No. Did their world change completely? This is what quantum jumping actually looks like. When who I am changes, where I am must change as well. Because reality is not separate from identity. Reality is a mirror, not a destination. It does not respond to wishes. It responds to coherence. This is why trying to jump timelines while holding on to the same inner identity creates frustration. You may visualize abundance while still identifying as someone who struggles. You may imagine peace while still living from a baseline of tension. The mind may speak one language, but the identity speaks another, and reality listens to the deeper voice. An identity shift is not something you do. It is something that happens when an old way of being no longer feels true. Often, this occurs after the collapse of a false self. The self that was built to cope, to survive, to please, to control. That self worked when it needed to. It kept you safe in difficult seasons. But there comes a point when continuing to live from that identity feels heavier than letting it go. And in that moment, without effort, the shift begins. This is why quantum jumps are often preceded by stillness rather than action, by a pause, by a sense of, I can't keep doing this the same way. The mind may interpret this as confusion or stagnation, but at the level of consciousness, something is recalibrating. The old identity is loosening its grip. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening. Inside, a profound reorganization is underway. And here is something important to understand. Identity does not change because circumstances improve. Circumstances improve because identity changes. This is the reversal that transforms everything. When you no longer see yourself as someone chasing life, but as someone meeting it, the quality of experience shifts immediately. When you no longer relate to the future as a place of salvation, but to the present as sufficient, time itself feels different. The anxiety that once fueled ambition begins to dissolve, and action becomes more natural, more effective, and strangely effortless. This is not passivity. It is alignment. Quantum jumping is alignment reaching a tipping point. It is the moment when the inner narrative no longer matches the old timeline, and the old timeline can no longer sustain itself. It fades, not because you rejected it, but because you stopped identifying with it, like a role you played for years, then one day realized you were no longer interested in performing. When identity shifts, the question, where am I going, quietly transforms into, how am I being? And that shift alone opens the door to a new timeline, without requiring movement, struggle, or proof. This is why the most powerful changes often feel anticlimactic. There is no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, just a calm recognition I am no longer the person who reacts this way. And from that recognition, a new sequence of events begins. People often ask, how will I know I've quantum jumped? The answer is simple, though not flashy. You will know because you no longer relate to your life the way you used to. Situations that once defined you no longer hold the same meaning. You respond rather than react. You choose rather than defend. You feel less urgency to explain yourself to the world. These are signs that the identity shift has already occurred. And once that shift stabilizes, reality does not need instructions. It adjusts automatically. Relationships recalibrate. Paths open or close without struggle. You find yourself living a life that matches who you have become, not who you were trying to escape. Quantum jumping, then, is not about leaving your life behind. It is about becoming someone for whom a different life is natural. When I am changes, I am here changes with it. Not because you jumped, but because you finally allowed yourself to stand where you already belonged. 3. Vibration is the key, not willpower. There comes a moment on this path when effort quietly reveals its limitation. You may have noticed it already. You tried harder, thought more positively, pushed yourself to stay focused, disciplined your mind, corrected your emotions, and yet the deeper pattern of your life did not truly change. It may have shifted briefly, but then it settled back into familiar territory, as if something unseen was gently but firmly guiding it home. That moment is not a failure. It is an initiation into a deeper truth. Willpower is not the engine of transformation. Vibration is. This is difficult for the conditioned mind to accept, because we were taught that change requires effort, persistence, and control. From an early age, we learn that if we want something different, we must try harder, think better, discipline ourselves more strictly, and for certain surface-level tasks, that approach works. But when it comes to timelines, to the deep architecture of lived reality, effort often works against us. Effort is usually born from fear. Fear of not having enough. Fear of staying where we are. Fear that if we stop pushing, everything will fall apart. Vibration, on the other hand, arises from permission. Permission to feel what is already true. Permission to rest in a different inner climate without needing justification. Permission to stop arguing with the present moment. This difference changes everything. When effort is driving your transformation, there is tension in your system. Even if your words sound hopeful, your body is braced. Your nervous system is still signaling lack, urgency, or threat, and reality responds not to your words, but to that underlying signal. The timeline you remain in is the one that matches the vibration you are actually emitting, not the one you are trying to reach. This is why forced positivity feels exhausting. You may repeat affirmations while something inside you resists, quietly whispering, "This isn't true yet." That resistance is not wrong. It is simply honest. And reality listens to honesty more than performance. A timeline does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you are. This is one of the most sobering and liberating truths on this journey. Sobering, because it removes the fantasy that wishing alone will carry you somewhere else. Liberating, because it frees you from the endless struggle to fix yourself. You cannot force yourself into a new timeline through fake optimism. You cannot bully your inner world into alignment. You cannot trick reality with words that your body does not believe. The field you live in responds to your state of being, not your intentions about the future. Think of it like this. You cannot tune a musical instrument by shouting at it. You tune it by listening, by sensing where it is tight, where it is loose, and gently adjusting until the sound becomes clear. Life works the same way. When your inner vibration is tense, rushed, or contracted, no amount of mental effort will create harmony. But when you soften, when you allow yourself to settle into a different frequency, reality resonates naturally. This is why true shifts often occur when people stop trying, not because they gave up on life, but because they stopped fighting themselves. You may have experienced this in small ways. Perhaps you struggled for years to solve a problem, only to find the answer appear when you finally relaxed your grip. Or you tried to force a relationship to work, only to see clarity emerge when you let go of control. These moments are not accidents. They are demonstrations of how vibration leads and form follows. Effort says, "I must become something else to be okay." Vibration says, "I am allowed to be okay now." That difference is subtle, but profound. When you are operating from effort, you are implicitly saying that the present moment is insufficient. That insufficiency becomes the dominant signal you send into the field of experience. Life, ever consistent, reflects it back through delay, resistance, or repeated lessons. When you are operating from vibration, you are no longer negotiating with life. You are meeting it. You are inhabiting a state that does not need to be proven. From that state, different timelines become accessible because you are no longer contradicting them internally. This is also why timeline shifts cannot be scheduled. They cannot be forced into existence by sheer determination. They emerge when your inner state stabilizes at a new frequency. And stabilization does not happen through intensity. It happens through consistency. Consistency of being. When you allow yourself to feel safe before circumstances improve. When you allow yourself to feel fulfilled before results arrive. When you allow yourself to feel grounded, even while uncertainty remains. These are not acts of denial. They are acts of alignment. The mind often resists this idea because it feels irresponsible. It asks, if I stop trying, won't I stagnate? But stopping effort does not mean stopping movement. It means changing the source of movement. Action that arises from alignment is still action, but it is no longer fueled by fear. It is cleaner, more precise, more effective. This is why some people seem to move forward with ease while others exhaust themselves without progress. The difference is not intelligence or discipline. It is the inner tone from which action arises. A timeline responds to your present vibration, not your future plans. You may desire abundance, peace, or connection, but if your present state is dominated by contraction, striving, or self-doubt, that is the timeline you are feeding. Desire alone does not move you. Being does. This can feel confronting, especially for those who have relied on willpower their entire lives. But it is also deeply compassionate, because it means you are not broken. You are simply tuned to a certain frequency. And frequencies can change without struggle. Vibration shifts through allowance. Allowance of emotion without judgment. Allowance of rest without guilt. Allowance of uncertainty without panic. These small acts of permission recalibrate the nervous system. And as the nervous system settles, perception changes. You see options you did not see before. You respond differently to the same situations. And because response shapes reality, your timeline begins to shift organically. This is why the most effective inner work often looks unproductive from the outside. Sitting quietly, breathing, letting feelings move without analyzing them, choosing not to react in old ways. These are not passive acts. They are profound vibrational adjustments. When you stop trying to escape the present moment changes. This is the paradox at the heart of quantum jumping. The less you try to jump, the more you shift. The less you chase a new timeline, the more it meets you, not because you earned it, but because you stopped resisting it. You were never meant to force your way into a different life. You were meant to allow a different life to emerge through you. And when vibration leads, willpower can finally rest. 4. Inner identity, the true doorway between timelines. If there is one place where all timelines quietly converge, it is not in time, space, or circumstance. It is in what we might call inner identity. This is the doorway most people walk past without noticing, even though they pass through it every single day. They search for change in the outer world, in decisions, relationships, careers, or locations, while the real gate remains untouched inside them, patiently waiting. Inner identity is not your job. It is not your role in society. It is not even the story you tell about your past. Inner identity is the felt sense of who you believe yourself to be when no one is watching. It is the quiet background assumption that colors how you interpret every experience. It answers questions you rarely ask out loud. Like, what kind of life do I live? Or what usually happens to people like me? Or what should I expect when I relax my guard? These assumptions do not shout. They whisper. And because they whisper, they are powerful. Many people confuse identity with labels. They think, I am a parent, I am an engineer, I am successful, or I am struggling. But these are surface identities, temporary roles that change as life moves. Inner identity is deeper. It is the emotional and existential position you inhabit beneath all roles. It might be I am safe or I must always be careful. It might be life supports me, or nothing comes easily. It might be I belong or I am always on the outside. This inner identity determines which timelines feel available to you and which feel impossible. regardless of how hard you try. You can change careers, relationships, or environments. But if your inner identity remains the same patterns will quietly reassemble themselves. Different faces, different settings, but the same emotional themes. This is why some people seem to repeat the same life over and over in different forms, wondering why nothing truly changes. The timeline did not follow them. Their identity did. When we talk about quantum jumping as an identity shift, this is what we mean. You do not move into a new timeline by adding something to yourself. You move by releasing an identification that no longer fits. And often, that release feels less like gaining power and more like laying down a burden you have been carrying for years. Many of the identities we live from were never consciously chosen. They formed during moments when we needed to make sense of pain, uncertainty, or limitation. Perhaps at some point you learned that being vigilant kept you safe, or that being self-sacrificing earned you love, or that expecting disappointment softened the blow when it arrived. These identities were intelligent responses at the time. They helped you survive. But survival identities are not meant to become permanent homes. As long as you continue to identify as the one who must struggle, wait, prove, or endure, the timeline that matches that identity remains active. Not because life is cruel, but because life is consistent. It mirrors who you believe yourself to be. This is why the moment you stop identifying with the old version of yourself, the old timeline begins to dissolve on its own. You do not need to fight it. You do not need to analyze it endlessly. You simply stop feeding it with belief and emotional energy. When someone releases the identity of the victim, life no longer needs to provide circumstances that confirm victimhood. When someone releases the identity of lack, situations that reinforce scarcity quietly lose relevance. When someone releases the identity of waiting, life no longer withholds itself to create anticipation. This release is rarely dramatic. In fact, it often feels anticlimactic. There is no grand declaration, no final battle with the past. Instead, there is a gentle recognition. This way of seeing myself no longer feels true, and that recognition is enough. At that moment, the old timeline does not collapse. It simply stops being selected. This is one of the most compassionate truths you can realize. You are not trapped in a timeline because you did something wrong. You are simply loyal to an identity that once served you. When that loyalty softens, new realities become accessible without effort. Inner identity shifts not through force, but through honesty. Honesty about what you are tired of carrying. Honesty about what no longer resonates. Honesty about who you no longer want to be. Often, this honesty emerges after periods of darkness. Times when life stripped away distractions and left you face to face with yourself. Those moments can feel like failure or loss, but from a deeper perspective, they are invitations. Invitations to stop pretending, stop performing, and stop sustaining an identity that requires constant effort. This is why many people experience their most profound shifts after burnout, heartbreak, or disillusionment. The old self can no longer be maintained, and in that collapse, something simpler appears. Not a stronger self, a truer one. A self that does not need to fight reality to exist. As this inner identity stabilizes, you may notice subtle changes. You stop explaining yourself so much. You stop chasing validation. You stop bracing for disappointment. None of this is forced. It simply happens because the internal reference point has moved, and as it moves, timelines adjust accordingly. People often ask, how do I change my inner identity? But this question still assumes effort. Identity does not change because you decide it should. It changes because you see through it. You recognize that what you thought was me was actually a pattern, a posture, a habit of perception, and once seen clearly, it loses its grip. You do not need to destroy the old identity. You only need to stop mistaking it for who you are. When that happens, a sense of quiet freedom emerges. You are still yourself, but lighter, more present, less defined by history. And in that openness, different choices feel natural. different responses arise. Different futures feel reachable without strain. This is the doorway between timelines. Not a leap, not a ritual, not a mental technique, but a shift in the answer to the question, who am I being right now? When that answer changes, even slightly, reality listens. The old timeline does not argue, it simply fades. And the new one does not rush in, it meets you gently, as if it had been waiting all along for you to recognize yourself. 5. Reality does not change, it reorganizes. One of the most surprising truths you discover when you begin to see life through the lens of consciousness is this: reality almost never changes in the way the mind expects it to. There is no explosion, no dramatic turning point that announces, you are now in a new timeline. No moment where everything suddenly looks unrecognizable. And yet, somehow, everything becomes different. Not because reality transformed itself overnight, but because it quietly reorganized around a new inner center. This is where many people get confused. They expect a shift to feel big, obvious, conclusive. They wait for a clear sign that something has happened. And because that sign never arrives in the way they imagined, they assume nothing has changed. But real transformation is rarely loud. It is subtle, efficient, and almost modest in its expression. When a timeline shifts, reality does not replace itself. It rearranges itself. Like furniture being moved in a familiar room while the lights are dim. When the lights come back on, you are still in the same room, but the way you move through it is different. Corners that once felt tight feel open. Pathways that were blocked are suddenly clear. Nothing new was added. Nothing dramatic occurred. And yet, your experience of the space has changed completely. This is how life responds to an inner shift. There are no fireworks because fireworks are not required. The field of reality is incredibly responsive. The moment your inner state stabilizes in a new frequency, the outer world begins making small, precise adjustments. People respond to you differently without knowing why. Conversations take unexpected turns. Decisions you once agonized over now feel obvious. Opportunities appear not because you hunted them down, but because you are finally in resonance with them. This process is so quiet that the mind often misses it. We are conditioned to believe that change must be forceful to be real, that progress must be visible to be valid. But consciousness does not operate that way. It moves with economy. It does not waste energy on spectacle. It simply aligns form with frequency. When that alignment begins, you may notice that certain people drift out of your life without conflict. There is no dramatic ending. No explanation required. You simply stop meeting them at the same emotional place. At the same time, new connections may appear effortlessly, as if life introduced you to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Not because fate intervened, but because your inner state finally matched the conditions for that meeting. This is not coincidence. It is reorganization. The same is true of opportunities. You may find that doors open where you did not even know there were doors, or that paths you were once obsessed with suddenly lose their pull. You stop chasing what no longer aligns, and life stops presenting it to you, not as punishment, but as refinement. Reality is always listening, but it listens to coherence, not desire. This is why you do not find a new timeline. You do not search for it or work your way toward it. A timeline is not a destination waiting to be reached. It is a configuration of reality that activates when your inner state matches it. When that match occurs, the timeline finds you. It begins with subtle signals. A thought you would have dismissed before now feels relevant. A choice you once feared now feels natural. A risk that once felt reckless now feels clear. None of this feels dramatic. In fact, it often feels strangely ordinary. That is the paradox. The most profound changes feel normal when they arrive, because they are no longer in conflict with who you are. This is why people often say, "It just made sense," when describing life-altering decisions. From the outside, those decisions may look bold or unexpected. From the inside, they feel inevitable. They arise not from impulse, but from alignment. As reality reorganizes, You may also notice that your sense of time changes. The urgency fades. You are no longer racing toward the future or dragging the past behind you. You are more present. Not because you are trying to be mindful, but because there is less internal resistance pulling you away from the moment. When resistance dissolves, presence becomes natural, and from presence, clarity emerges. This clarity does not shout. It does not rush. It simply guides you one step at a time. And each step, though small, moves you deeper into a different configuration of life, a different timeline, if you like that word. But again, nothing leaps, nothing breaks, everything adjusts. This is why people sometimes look back years later and realize how much has changed without being able to point to a single defining moment. The change happened gradually, but consistently. Each small reorganization compounded over time until the overall pattern of life was no longer the same. This is how reality honors inner shifts. It does not overwhelm you with sudden transformation. It meets you at the pace you can integrate. It introduces change in ways that feel safe to your nervous system, because the goal is not shock. The goal is stability. A new timeline is not meant to feel foreign. It is meant to feel like home. When people try to force dramatic change, they often destabilize themselves. They uproot too much, too quickly, without an inner foundation to support it. The result is chaos rather than freedom. But when reality reorganizes itself in response to a genuine inner shift, the change feels supportive, grounded, sustainable. This is also why patience is not passive in this process. Patience is active trust. It is the understanding that once alignment has occurred, reality will do its part without interference. You do not need to manage the details. You do not need to orchestrate outcomes. Your role is to remain honest with your inner state and responsive to what presents itself. When you do that, life becomes collaborative. You are no longer pushing against it or pulling it toward you. You are moving with it. And in that movement, you may realize that what you once called manifestation feels less like creating and more like recognizing what is already forming. This recognition brings a deep sense of relief. You stop asking, "How do I make this happen?" You start noticing, "This is already happening." That shift alone changes how you engage with the world. You are less desperate, less attached, more available. And availability is one of the most magnetic states a human being can embody. Not because it demands attention, but because it allows connection. As reality reorganizes, you may also notice that certain problems simply dissolve, not because they were solved, but because they no longer belong in your current configuration. You have outgrown them. The questions that once consumed your energy no longer feel relevant. The struggles that once defined your days lose their emotional charge. This is not avoidance. It is evolution. And evolution does not announce itself. It unfolds. The mind may still look for confirmation. It may ask, "Is this it?" But the deeper self already knows. It knows because life feels less like a battle and more like a conversation. It knows because you are no longer trying to become someone else. You are simply allowing yourself to be where you already are. This is the quiet miracle of reorganization. Reality does not need to change for you to experience a different life. It only needs to be rearranged around a different center of gravity. When that center shifts from fear to trust, from control to allowance, from striving to presence, the entire pattern of experience adjusts accordingly. You do not chase a new timeline. You do not force it into existence. You live in a way that makes it inevitable. And then, almost without noticing, you realize that life has found you in a place that once felt far away, but now feels exactly right. 6. The role of the observing consciousness, the observer effect. There is a quiet moment that often goes unnoticed in the process of change. And yet it is the moment where everything truly begins. It is not the moment when circumstances shift, or when decisions are made, or when the outer world responds. It is the moment when the way you see yourself changes, not intellectually, not as an idea, but as a lived perception. This is where the observer steps into focus. In quantum physics, there is a principle that unsettles the rational mind and humbles it at the same time. Subatomic particles do not exist in a fixed state until they are observed. Before observation, they remain in a field of probabilities, not yet decided, not yet collapsed into a single form. The act of observation does not merely reveal reality. It participates in shaping it. This is not poetry. This is experimental science. And yet, the deeper implication of this principle extends far beyond the laboratory. Because if reality at its most fundamental level responds to observation, then life itself cannot be separate from the consciousness that experiences it. The observer is not outside the system. The observer is part of the equation. Your life behaves the same way. Most people live as if reality is fixed, and they are simply reacting to it. They see themselves as passive recipients of circumstance, shaped by history, limited by conditions, defined by patterns that seem unchangeable. From that position, observation becomes unconscious. You look at your life through old assumptions, old identities, old emotional lenses, and reality faithfully reflects them back. Not because it wants to trap you, but because it has no reason to do otherwise. When you observe yourself as someone who is struggling, life organizes itself around struggle. When you observe yourself as someone who is waiting, life arranges itself around delay. When you observe yourself as someone who must fight to survive, reality becomes something to fight against. This observation is rarely verbalized. It is embodied. It lives in posture, breath, reaction, expectation. And this is why the observer effect matters so deeply in the context of timelines. A timeline does not collapse into form based on what you hope for. It collapses based on how you observe yourself now. The identity you look at yourself through becomes the lens that selects which possibilities solidify into experience. This is where the misunderstanding often arises. People hear that consciousness shapes reality and immediately try to observe themselves as successful or see themselves as abundant, while still feeling fundamentally unsafe or unworthy. The observation remains conceptual. While the embodied observer has not changed, reality responds to the embodied observer, not the imagined one. The observer is not your thoughts. The observer is the state from which thoughts arise. When that state shifts, observation shifts naturally. You do not have to convince yourself of anything. You simply begin to experience yourself differently. And that difference changes what becomes real. Consider this. There are moments in life when you look back at who you used to be and feel a kind of gentle distance. Not judgment, not regret, just distance. You recognize the old patterns, the old fears, the old urgency. But they no longer define you. In that moment, you are observing your past self from a new vantage point. That vantage point is a new observer. And from that observer, the same world looks different. The same challenges feel manageable. The same uncertainties no longer feel threatening. You have not changed the facts of life. You have changed the consciousness through which those facts are interpreted. This is why true shifts feel so calm. When the observer changes, reality does not need to convince you. It does not need to overwhelm you with proof. It simply begins to align with the new perception. Choices arise naturally. Responses soften. The emotional charge around situations dissolves. You are no longer forcing yourself to see differently. You simply do. And in that seeing, life settles into a new configuration. This is what it means when we say that when you observe yourself as a new person, reality freezes in a new way. The word freeze can be misleading if taken too literally. It does not mean rigidity. It means stabilization. It means that the field of possibility collapses around the observer you are embodying. Before the shift, many futures felt uncertain or inaccessible. After the shift, certain outcomes feel obvious, while others quietly disappear from relevance. Not because you rejected them, but because they no longer match the observer you have become. This process is subtle and deeply personal. It does not require understanding quantum physics. It requires honesty. Honesty about how you are actually perceiving yourself in this moment. Are you observing yourself as someone who must constantly manage life? or as someone who can meet life without defense? Are you observing yourself as someone who is always catching up, or as someone who is already enough where they are? These observations shape the field. And here is the part that often surprises people. The observer does not change through effort. You cannot force yourself to see yourself differently. The observer changes when identification relaxes. When you stop gripping the old self. When you stop narrating your life through the same familiar story. Often, this happens when you slow down enough to notice the space behind your thoughts, the place where awareness itself rests. In that space, you are no longer the character in the story. You are the one watching the story unfold. And from that position, the story begins to change on its own. This is why presence is so powerful. Presence is not a technique. It is a shift in observation. When you are present, you are no longer observing life through memory or projection. You are observing from direct awareness, and awareness does not carry the same assumptions as the conditioned mind. From presence, you see options where before you saw limitations. You feel responses rather than reactions. You sense timing instead of forcing action. And because reality is responsive to observation, these changes ripple outward. People may say things like, "You seem different," without being able to explain why. Situations that once escalated now resolve themselves. Paths that felt blocked now open without resistance. This is not because you are controlling reality. It is because you are no longer observing it through conflict. The observer effect, in this sense, is not about power. It is about clarity. When the observer is clear, reality becomes coherent. This is also why trying to change the world without changing the observer is exhausting. You may rearrange circumstances endlessly, but if the observer remains rooted in fear, lack, or mistrust, the same themes will continue to appear. The world is not the problem. The lens is, and lenses can change, not through effort, but through insight. The moment you realize that you are not the thoughts you have about yourself, but the awareness in which those thoughts appear, the observer begins to shift. And as it shifts, the timeline reorganizes accordingly. You do not need to manage this process. You only need to remain honest with what you are identifying with. This honesty brings humility. It removes the need to perform spirituality or mastery. It allows you to say, "This is where I am seeing from right now." And that acknowledgement alone begins to loosen old patterns. When the observer softens, life softens in response. This is not theory. It is lived experience. You are not here to control reality. You are here to see clearly. And when seeing becomes clear, reality settles into a form that reflects that clarity. That is the quiet power of the observer effect in your life. Not a dramatic force, not a mystical trick, but a simple truth. The way you observe yourself determines the world that solidifies around you. Change the observer, and the timeline changes with it. 7. Signs you are shifting timelines without even realizing it. One of the most confusing aspects of a real timeline shift is that it rarely looks like what people expect. There is no dramatic announcement, no internal voice declaring that something extraordinary has happened. In fact, many people are already living inside a new timeline, while still wondering why they feel so different. They assume nothing has changed because the outer circumstances look mostly the same. But the deepest shifts always happen beneath the surface first. A timeline shift does not begin with events. It begins with perception. One of the earliest signs is a subtle but unmistakable change in how you react. Situations that once triggered immediate emotional responses now pass through you with far less intensity. You notice something has happened, but it does not hijack your nervous system the way it used to. You are still aware. You still care. But you are no longer consumed. This can feel strange at first. Some people even worry that they have become detached or indifferent. But this is not numbness. It is regulation. It is the nervous system no longer living in constant alert mode. You are responding from presence instead of habit. You may catch yourself thinking, "That would have upset me deeply before," and realizing that now, it simply doesn't. There is no effort involved. You are not suppressing anything. The reaction just does not arise. That absence is not emptiness. It is space. And space is a sign of a new timeline stabilizing. Another sign is that things which once felt extremely important suddenly lose their grip on you. Goals you chased relentlessly no longer feel urgent. Opinions you defended passionately no longer feel worth the energy. Even certain desires soften, not because you have given up on life, but because those desires belonged to a previous version of you. This can be unsettling for the mind, which likes continuity. The mind asks, if I don't want what I used to want, who am I now? But this question itself signals transition. You are no longer orbiting around the same identity. The gravitational pull has changed. This is often when people describe a sense of quiet disorientation, not panic, not confusion, just a feeling that the old reference points no longer apply, while the new ones are still forming. This is not a mistake. It is a natural phase of reorientation, like stepping off a moving walkway and feeling the ground shift beneath you for a moment. At the same time, many people report a growing sense of peace that seems disproportionate to their circumstances. Life may still be uncertain, challenges may still exist, but the internal struggle around them has eased. You are no longer negotiating with reality every moment. You are meeting it. This peace is not excitement. It is not happiness in the conventional sense. It is steadiness. And steadiness is a powerful indicator of vibrational change. When your vibration shifts before your circumstances do, it can feel almost anticlimactic. You expect relief to come after life improves. But instead, relief arrives first. This reverses the old pattern where peace depended on outcomes. Now peace becomes the ground from which outcomes emerge. This is often when people say, I don't know why, but I feel okay. And that sentence, simple as it sounds, marks a profound shift. Feeling okay without needing a reason means you are no longer anchored to the old timeline that required conditions to be met before allowing ease. Another sign is that you stop explaining yourself so much. You feel less compelled to justify your choices, your pace, your needs. It is not that you have become closed off. You are simply less interested in defending your existence. This happens naturally when your inner identity stabilizes. You no longer seek confirmation because you are no longer uncertain about where you stand. This also shows up in relationships. You may notice that certain dynamics quietly dissolve. Arguments that once repeated themselves no longer find traction. You stop participating in emotional loops that used to feel unavoidable. Not because you are trying to be spiritual or evolved, but because something in you has shifted out of resonance. Some connections fade without conflict. Others deepen without effort. This is not about cutting people off. It is about no longer meeting them from the same emotional place. When resonance changes, interaction changes. You may also notice a shift in how you experience time. Urgency diminishes. You are less rushed, even when busy. You stop feeling like you are constantly behind. This is a significant sign, because the sense of being behind is a core feature of many old timelines. When it disappears, even partially, it indicates that your relationship with the future has changed. You are no longer chasing yourself. There is also a subtler sign that often goes unnoticed. Your thoughts become quieter, not because you are forcing them to stop, but because they are no longer fueled by tension. The inner commentary softens. The constant evaluation, comparison, and rehearsal lose momentum. Silence begins to appear between thoughts, and that silence feels natural rather than uncomfortable. This does not mean problems vanish. It means problems no longer dominate your inner landscape. In this quieter space, intuition becomes clearer. Decisions feel simpler. You may still weigh options, but the process feels grounded instead of anxious. You trust yourself more, not because you have all the answers, but because you are no longer operating from fear. This is one of the clearest signs of a timeline shift. Trust emerges before evidence. You trust your timing. You trust your capacity. You trust life enough to stop micromanaging it. And from that trust, life begins to meet you differently. Another sign is that you become less interested in fixing yourself. Self-improvement loses its edge. You may still grow, learn, and refine. But the underlying tone changes. Growth no longer feels like correction. It feels like expression. You are not trying to become worthy. You are allowing yourself to unfold. This is often when people step back from constant self-analysis. They stop dissecting every emotion, every choice, every perceived flaw. They realize that awareness does not require scrutiny to function. It requires presence. And presence, once established, naturally recalibrates life. Perhaps the most telling sign of all is this: you feel less dramatic about your own transformation. You are not trying to convince anyone that you have changed. You are not seeking validation for your growth. You are simply living differently. And that feels enough. This quiet confidence is not arrogance. It is coherence. It means your inner state has stabilized enough that it no longer needs external reinforcement. And when that happens, the outer world begins adjusting in ways that feel supportive rather than challenging. Opportunities appear without urgency. Solutions emerge without struggle. Clarity replaces compulsion. And still, nothing explodes. Nothing announces itself. Life simply begins to flow more smoothly. This is why many people only realize they have shifted timelines in hindsight. They look back and see that they stopped suffering in the same way long before circumstances changed. They became kinder to themselves before life became kinder to them. They found peace before they found answers. This sequence is not backward. It is correct. Vibration always changes before form. If you recognize yourself in any of these signs, there is nothing you need to do, no action to take, no process to accelerate. The shift is already underway. Your only role is to remain honest with what feels true now, rather than clinging to what once defined you. The old timeline dissolves not through rejection, but through irrelevance, and the new one does not demand belief. It simply invites participation. You are not meant to notice a timeline shift the way you notice an event. You are meant to live it the way you live a new season of your life. Gradually, naturally, with less resistance. When the inner vibration changes, reality follows in its own time. And often, by the time the world reflects it clearly, you have already moved on, grounded in a peace that no longer needs confirmation. 8. Why quantum jumps always happen in silence. One of the most overlooked truths about real transformation is that it rarely announces itself. There is no moment where life pauses to applaud you. No clear line you cross where the world confirms, yes, you have shifted. In fact, the deeper the change, the quieter it tends to be. This can feel confusing at first, especially if you were expecting something dramatic, something undeniable. But silence is not the absence of change. Silence is the signature of authenticity. A new reality does not need proof. When a quantum jump occurs, it does not arrive to be witnessed, explained, or validated. It arrives to be lived. The need to prove that something has changed belongs to the old identity, the one that measured its worth through external confirmation. The new state has no such urgency. It does not need to be seen to be real. It simply is. This is why silence is so natural to genuine shifts. When you no longer doubt your own state of being, there is nothing to defend. When you are no longer trying to convince yourself that you have arrived somewhere better, you do not feel compelled to convince anyone else either. The change settles inward before it ever reaches the surface. The old self loves a big story. It wants a clear narrative where you were, what happened, and how you became someone new. It wants milestones, explanations, and visible markers of progress. This storytelling impulse is not wrong. It once served a purpose. It helped you orient yourself in a world that felt uncertain. It gave structure to growth. But storytelling is also a form of control. It tries to define change before change has fully integrated. The new state does not rush to explain itself. When consciousness shifts, it moves beneath language. Words arrive later, if at all. There is a felt sense of rightness that does not need articulation. You simply notice that you are living differently. You respond differently. You breathe differently. And these changes do not feel like achievements. They feel like returns. This is why the ego often feels uneasy during real quantum jumps. It looks for evidence. It asks, is this enough? Did something actually happen? Shouldn't this feel bigger? But the ego is oriented toward form. Consciousness is oriented toward coherence. And coherence does not require attention to function. Silence allows coherence to stabilize. When change happens quietly, it has room to take root. It is not distorted by performance. It is not rushed by expectation. It integrates at the level of the nervous system, the body, the subtle habits of perception. Loud change often collapses under its own weight because it tries to leap ahead of integration. Quiet change endures because it honors timing. Think of how the deepest healing in the body occurs. Cells repair themselves silently. Bones knit together without announcement. The most vital processes do not ask to be seen. They simply do their work. Consciousness operates in the same way. When it recalibrates, it does so gently, without spectacle, because spectacle would disrupt the process. This is why many people do not realize they have shifted until much later. They may be living differently for months, even years, before they suddenly recognize how far they have come. They look back and see that the old patterns are gone, not because they fought them, but because they stopped feeding them. The change was happening all along. But there was no moment dramatic enough for the mind to label it as transformation. This can feel anticlimactic to those who are searching for meaning in intensity. But intensity is not depth. Depth is quiet. The most profound changes are often invisible to others, and sometimes even to yourself in the beginning. Friends may not notice. Family may still relate to you as you were. Life on the surface may look similar, but inside, something fundamental has shifted. You are no longer anchored to the same emotional gravity. This invisibility is not a flaw. It is protection. If every inner shift demanded recognition, it would become fragile. It would depend on feedback. Silence allows the new state to become stable without interference. It allows you to inhabit it without questioning it. Over time, the outer world will reflect it naturally. But by then, you will no longer be waiting for that reflection. Another reason quantum jumps happen in silence is that the new consciousness does not seek contrast. The old self defined itself by comparison before and after, success and failure, higher and lower. The new state does not need these distinctions. It is not interested in proving that it is better. It is interested in being true. Truth does not argue. Truth does not advertise. Truth does not rush. When you are aligned with truth, you stop narrating your life as a project. You stop framing every experience as evidence of progress or regression. You simply live. And living from alignment has a way of simplifying everything. Decisions become quieter. Preferences become clearer. Boundaries establish themselves without force. This is often when people say, "I don't feel like I need to talk about it anymore." Not because they are hiding, but because there is nothing to explain. The experience speaks for itself in the quality of presence it brings. Silence also allows grief to pass without drama. When you leave an old timeline, you are also leaving behind versions of yourself that once mattered deeply. There may be sadness in that. There may be tenderness. But the new state does not need to dramatize the loss. It honors it quietly. It lets what has ended end without reopening the story again and again. This is another reason real shifts feel understated. They are complete. They do not need revisiting. And because they are complete, they do not demand attention. The world we live in often celebrates loud change, public declarations, visible milestones. But consciousness evolves differently. It evolves through subtle reorientation, through the quiet withdrawal of energy from what no longer resonates, through the gentle redirection of attention toward what feels true now. These movements are easy to miss if you are waiting for confirmation. But the absence of confirmation is the confirmation. When you no longer need to announce your growth, it is because growth is no longer an activity. It is a condition. When you no longer need to convince yourself that something has changed, it is because the change is no longer in question. This is why silence is such a reliable indicator of a quantum jump. Noise belongs to transition. Silence belongs to arrival. Not arrival at a destination, but arrival into yourself. Over time, the outer world will adjust. People will respond differently. Circumstances will reflect your new state. But by then, those reflections will feel secondary. You will not be waiting for them to prove anything. You will already know. And this knowing is calm. It does not rush to speak. It does not need to be understood. It simply rests. If you find yourself in a season where things feel quieter than usual, where you are less compelled to explain, less interested in big narratives, less reactive to external validation, do not assume that nothing is happening. Often, that quiet is the sound of a deep shift integrating. The old self needed noise to feel real. The new consciousness recognizes itself in stillness. This is why quantum jumps do not arrive with spectacle. They arrive with simplicity, with an unremarkable sense of rightness, with a life that feels less like a performance and more like a presence. And in that presence, without anyone needing to notice, reality begins to align around you in ways that feel natural, sustainable, and quietly profound. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is coherence settling in. And when coherence settles, there is nothing left to prove. 9. Letting go of control is the real jump. There is a moment on this path that feels almost backward to everything we were taught. A moment when it becomes clear that the shift you have been seeking does not require more effort, more discipline, or more strategies. It requires less gripping, less managing, less trying to hold life together with sheer force of will. This realization can feel unsettling at first, because control has often been mistaken for safety. But beneath that discomfort lies a freedom that is quieter and far more enduring. The real jump is not something you add. It is something you release. Most people believe change comes from doing more thinking, more planning, more fixing. This belief is deeply ingrained, especially in cultures that equate worth with productivity and progress with struggle. But when it comes to timelines, doing more often reinforces the very state you are trying to leave. Effort keeps you identified with the one who is trying to get somewhere else. And as long as that identity remains, the old timeline stays active. Letting go does not mean giving up on life. It means giving up the illusion that life must be controlled to be lived well. Control is not neutral. It carries a specific vibration. It assumes that without constant management, things will fall apart. It assumes that the present moment is not trustworthy, and that assumption becomes the emotional ground from which reality responds. When control dominates, life reflects back resistance, unpredictability, and fatigue, not as punishment, but as resonance. This is why people often feel exhausted even when they are doing everything right. They are not tired because they lack discipline. They are tired because they are carrying an identity that believes everything depends on them. Letting go begins when you notice how much of your energy is spent maintaining a version of yourself that is always bracing for disappointment, bracing for loss, bracing for the next thing that needs fixing. This posture becomes so familiar that it feels like who you are, but it is not who you are. It is a strategy you learned when uncertainty felt overwhelming. And strategies, no matter how useful they once were, are not meant to become identities. When you loosen your grip on control, you are not abandoning responsibility. You are releasing an outdated agreement with fear. You are saying, perhaps for the first time, I do not need to manage every outcome to be safe. That statement may not feel entirely true at first, and that is okay. Letting go is not a dramatic declaration. It is a gradual softening. You release control in small, honest ways. You stop replaying conversations that have already passed. You stop rehearsing disasters that have not happened. You stop defining yourself by stories that belong to another season of your life. These are not acts of laziness. They are acts of trust. One of the most profound forms of control is identification with the past. Not just with memories, but with the meaning you assign to them. You may still carry the identity of someone who was hurt, overlooked, or forced to grow up too quickly. You may still see yourself through the lens of what once happened, even if life has changed significantly since then. As long as you hold on to that identity, the timeline that supports it remains active. This does not mean you deny your history. It means you stop living from it. There is a subtle difference between remembering the past and being loyal to it. Loyalty keeps you anchored. Memory does not. When you loosen your loyalty to old roles, old wounds, and old narratives, you are not betraying yourself. You are freeing yourself. The timeline that required you to be vigilant, defensive, or constantly proving yourself begins to dissolve when you stop feeding it with attention and emotional investment. It does not fight back. It simply loses relevance. This is the moment many people mistake for stagnation. They think, if I am not pushing forward, I must be falling behind. But what is actually happening is a transition from force to flow, from effort to alignment, from doing to being. When you stop trying to hold the old timeline together, you are no longer inside it. This is why letting go feels like a jump, even though nothing moves. The familiar ground disappears beneath your feet, not because you fell, but because you stopped standing where you no longer belonged. And for a moment, there can be uncertainty, a sense of not knowing what comes next. This is natural. Control provided predictability, even when it was painful. Letting go invites the unknown. But the unknown is not empty. It is open. In that openness, life begins to respond differently. You notice that you do not need to plan as far ahead. You trust your capacity to respond in the moment. You begin to experience life as something that meets you, rather than something you must chase or manage. This shift often brings relief before it brings clarity. You may not immediately know what the next step is, but you feel less tense about not knowing. That relaxation is not passive. It is intelligent. It signals to reality that you are no longer operating from fear, and reality responds to that signal. When control loosens, intuition strengthens. You hear yourself more clearly. You sense timing instead of forcing action. You recognize when to move and when to wait without turning waiting into anxiety. This is not because you have mastered patience. It is because patience arises naturally when you trust the process. Trust is not belief. Trust is the absence of resistance. Another layer of control that often goes unnoticed is the need to define yourself, to keep answering the question, who am I, with fixed labels and explanations. When you release control, you also release the need to constantly name yourself. You allow identity to be fluid, responsive, alive. This can feel uncomfortable for the ego, which prefers certainty. But for consciousness, fluidity is freedom. You are not here to maintain a consistent story. You are here to live truthfully as it unfolds. When you stop clinging to a fixed self, you stop clinging to a fixed timeline. The two are inseparable. The timeline you experience is simply the outer expression of the identity you are holding. When that identity loosens, the timeline rearranges accordingly. This is why the most powerful shifts often occur when people finally say, I don't need to know how this will work out. Not as resignation, but as release. They stop micromanaging the future. They stop revisiting the past. They allow the present moment to be sufficient. And from that sufficiency, movement emerges. This movement is not chaotic. It is coherent. It does not rush. It does not need reassurance. It unfolds step by step, guided by clarity rather than compulsion. You still act. You still choose. But the energy behind those actions is different. It is no longer strained. This is the real jump. Not a leap into something new, but a step out of something old. When you are no longer trying to hold on to the timeline that shaped your survival, you naturally exit it. There is no ceremony, no final goodbye. The grip simply relaxes. And with that relaxation, you find yourself living from a different place. A place where effort is replaced by responsiveness, where control is replaced by presence, where fear is replaced by trust. This does not make life perfect, but it makes life honest. And honesty has a way of aligning things far more effectively than force ever could. If you feel yourself in a season of letting go, where plans feel less solid and old identities feel less convincing, do not rush to fill the space. That space is not a problem. It is the doorway. It is where the old timeline loses its hold and the new one begins to form. You did not fail to control your life. You succeeded in releasing what no longer needed to be controlled. And in that release, without drama or effort, you step into a different way of being that feels lighter, truer, and more aligned than anything you could have planned. This is the jump that changes everything, precisely because it does not feel like a jump at all. 10. You do not move into a new timeline. You become it. At some point on this journey, something quietly settles. Not as an idea, not as a belief you need to repeat, but as a simple recognition that feels almost obvious once it arrives. You realize that you were never meant to travel into a new timeline. You were never meant to escape the present moment or leap into some distant version of reality. The truth is far more intimate than that. The timeline is not somewhere else. It is who you are being. This realization does not come with excitement. It comes with relief, because it removes the endless search, the looking ahead, the feeling that life is always happening later, somewhere just out of reach. When you see that the timeline you desire is not a place but a state, the struggle to get there dissolves. A timeline is a lived identity. It is the version of you that wakes up in the morning without resistance, the version that meets the day without bracing, the version that does not need to ask, "Am I allowed to be here yet?" because it already is. This version is not pretending. It is not performing confidence or peace. It is simply living from a different internal reference point. This is the culmination of everything you have been moving toward, often without knowing it. When people imagine becoming someone new, they often picture a dramatic transformation, a radical shift in personality, lifestyle, or appearance. But becoming the timeline you desire does not require you to abandon yourself. It requires you to stop delaying yourself. You become the timeline the moment you stop relating to your life as preparation. Preparation implies waiting. It implies that the real life has not started yet. But when you become the timeline, life is no longer something you rehearse for. It is something you inhabit fully, right where you are. This does not mean your circumstances instantly change. It means your relationship to them does. And that relationship is what shapes everything that follows. When your inner identity stabilizes, reality has no choice but to reflect it. Not because the universe is rewarding you, but because coherence demands consistency. Reality is not an independent force deciding whether you deserve a certain life. It is a mirror responding to the clarity of your being. This is why effort fades at this stage. You are no longer trying to align with a future self. You are living as the self you once imagined. And living as that self does not feel special. It feels normal. It feels grounded. It feels like the way life should have felt all along. This is often when people say, "I don't know when it happened, but something changed." That is because the shift was not an event. It was a settling. The internal debate ended. The identity stabilized. And from that stability, reality reorganized without negotiation. This is the difference between becoming and trying. Trying carries tension. Becoming carries ease. Trying asks, "How do I get there?" Becoming asks, "How do I live now?" When you become the timeline, you stop seeking permission from the future. You stop postponing peace, confidence, or wholeness until certain conditions are met. You allow those qualities to be present now, not as fantasy, but as embodied truth. This does not make you careless. It makes you coherent. From coherence, action arises naturally. You still make choices. You still set boundaries. You still respond to challenges. But the energy behind those actions is no longer strained. It is informed by trust rather than fear. You are no longer reacting from the past or reaching toward an imagined future. You are responding from presence. Presence is where timelines collapse into one. When you are fully present, you are not switching between who you were and who you hope to be. You are simply being. And being is powerful because it is unified. There is no internal contradiction. Thought, emotion, and identity move together. Reality recognizes this unity and reflects it. This is why manifestation becomes effortless at this stage. Not because you have learned how to manipulate reality, but because you have stopped contradicting it internally. There is no mixed signal, no internal argument. What you are matches what you experience. This alignment feels subtle, but its effects are profound. Life begins to feel responsive rather than resistant. Opportunities appear without urgency. Solutions arise without drama. Even challenges feel different. They no longer threaten your sense of self. They become part of the movement of life rather than obstacles to it. You do not feel like you are constantly adjusting yourself to fit reality. Reality adjusts to fit you, because you are no longer fragmented. This is the point where the question of timelines loses its fascination. You are no longer interested in jumping, shifting, or upgrading your reality. You are interested in living truthfully, and truth has a way of creating exactly the environment it needs to express itself. You may still grow, you may still evolve, but growth no longer feels like escape. It feels like expansion. You are not leaving something behind. You are unfolding something that was already present. This is why the idea of arrival becomes less relevant. There is no final destination where everything is perfect. There is only increasing alignment with who you truly are. And each layer of alignment creates a different expression of life, a different timeline, without requiring movement. You become the timeline by living as if you are already home. Home is not a place. Home is a state of coherence within yourself. When you live from that state, you do not wait for reality to confirm it. You move, speak, choose, and relate from it naturally. And reality, having no alternative, reflects it back. This is not a reward. It is a law of resonance. When your identity is stable, reality becomes stable. When your sense of self is clear, the world clarifies around you. When you stop asking life to be different before you allow yourself to be whole, life responds with a wholeness that feels earned, not through effort, but through honesty. This is the quiet completion of the journey, not a dramatic ending, not a final jump, but a gentle recognition that you were never meant to go anywhere else. You were meant to become the place you were seeking, and once you do, the timeline you once imagined as distant reveals itself as the life you are already living, moment by moment, without resistance, without striving, and without needing anything more to begin. Reality always follows consciousness. If there is one truth that quietly runs beneath everything we have explored, it is this: reality has never been ahead of you, and it has never been behind you. It has always been responding. What you experience as life is not something you must chase, fix, or outrun. It is something that follows the state of consciousness you are living from. Quantum jumping, when seen clearly, is not an escape from reality. It is not a way to bypass difficulty or leap into a fantasy where everything is suddenly perfect. It is a return to the most honest version of yourself, the one that exists beneath effort, beneath fear, beneath the constant need to manage outcomes. You were never meant to flee your life. You were meant to meet it differently. Throughout this journey, we have seen that timelines are not places you go, but states you inhabit. They are not future destinations waiting for you to arrive, but reflections waiting for you to stabilize. Each timeline corresponds to a version of you, not the version you are trying to become, but the version you are willing to be now. This is why consciousness always leads and reality follows. The world does not respond to your goals. It does not respond to your wishes. It responds to your way of being. When your inner state shifts, reality reorganizes itself to match that shift. Not dramatically, not loudly, but faithfully. It does not argue with your consciousness. It mirrors it. This is where so much suffering quietly dissolves, because the struggle to change the world softens when you realize that the world is not the starting point. The starting point has always been how you are present within it. Think of a still body of water. A timeline is like the image reflected on its surface. If you keep reaching into the water, stirring it, trying to force the reflection to change, the image only distorts. The more you interfere, the less clear it becomes. But when you stop moving, when the water settles, the reflection shifts on its own. not because you made it change, but because you stopped disrupting it. You do not need to stir reality. You need to stabilize your presence. When your vibration changes, when your identity settles into a truer state, the reflection cannot help but adjust. Reality has no alternative. It follows coherence. It follows clarity. It follows truth. This is why the most powerful transformations feel simple, not easy, but simple. They do not require you to become someone else. They require you to stop pretending to be someone you are not. They do not demand that you control life more effectively. They invite you to trust life more deeply. And trust, in this context, is not blind belief. Trust is relaxed awareness. It is the absence of resistance to the present moment. It is the willingness to stand where you are without rehearsing escape. It is the courage to let your identity update without clinging to old roles, memories, or definitions. When you live this way, life begins to meet you differently. Not because you are special, but because you are aligned. Alignment removes friction. It allows movement without force. It allows growth without strain. This is when you realize that quantum jumping was never about going anywhere else. It was about stopping the inner war, stopping the argument with reality, stopping the constant negotiation with time, stopping the belief that peace must be earned later. When that stopping occurs, something remarkable happens. The world does not need to change dramatically for you to feel different. You feel different first, and that feeling becomes the new ground from which everything else unfolds. This is the quiet reversal that changes everything. Instead of waiting for circumstances to improve before you allow yourself ease, you allow ease first. Instead of demanding certainty before you trust enough to move without certainty. Instead of fixing yourself to deserve a better life, you recognize that your life reflects the version of yourself you are willing to inhabit. And so, gradually, almost unnoticed, the world adjusts. People respond to you with less resistance. Opportunities appear without urgency. Decisions feel clearer, even when the future remains unknown. This is not magic, it is resonance. The deeper you settle into yourself, the less effort is required to live well. The more honest you become about who you are now, the less you need to plan who you will be later. Life begins to feel less like a test and more like a conversation. One where you are finally listening instead of trying to control the outcome. And here is the final, quiet truth. When you change the way you are present, the world does not need to change to accommodate you. It only needs time to catch up. Reality is not slow. It is precise. It waits until your inner state is stable before reflecting it fully. This is not delay. It is integration. It ensures that what appears in your life can be sustained, not just admired. So if you find yourself in a space where things feel calmer, quieter, less dramatic than before, do not mistake that for stagnation. Often, that quiet is the sound of alignment settling in. It is the pause after effort, the stillness after struggle, the moment where the old timeline loses its hold and the new one becomes natural. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not missing anything. You are simply arriving at yourself. And from that arrival, life unfolds in a way that does not require you to run ahead or look back. You walk forward naturally, not because you are chasing a future, but because the present is no longer something you need to escape. This is what it means to understand that reality always follows consciousness, not as a punishment, not as a reward, but as a reflection. Stand still in your truest state, and the mirror will change on its own. When you change how you are here, the world does not need to become something else. It only needs to recognize who you have become, and it always does.